and I'm really excited to share some of my master's research with you all pertaining to acclimation to stress in Western red cedar. So first, I would like to apologize because I believe I misspoke a little bit when I submitted my title to Cindy. I said Western red cedar adaptation, when in fact I'm dealing with acclimation. And it's important to understand that these two things are different, and that acclimation is more of a physiological or morphological response to stress that arises from repeated exposure and enhances survival. And a good example that we might all know is larches in the winter lose their needles to acclimate to colder and drier conditions, freezing conditions, whereas adaptations are more of heritable genetic changes that occur as the result of natural selection. So an example of that might be the Seguro cactus adapting to live in super dry deserts by becoming big and succulent. So with that, we can move on to my main research questions that I looked at. The first was, can Western red cedar acclimate to stress, and does topography have a significant impact on soil water availability? And to do this, we had a field site out in the northeastern side of Moscow Mountain, out on the edge of the Palouse on University of Idaho experimental forest land. They're very helpful in letting us use their land. And this field site was on the edge of the Palouse, like I mentioned, and it was very hot, very warm summer. And this is kind of on the southeastern edge of Western red cedar's range. So it's definitely a pretty dry site. The ash cap is present, so there was a lot of soil moisture available for Western red cedar to persist, and there was some bride's bonnet, wild ginger, and this is kind of, yeah, like I said, defined by a warm summer continental climate. And to do our field study, we looked at 3 different groups with 2 different canopy and topographic positions. The 2 groups on the left were closed canopy with about 200 square meters per hectare basal area, and the one on the right was an exposed canopy on the edge of a clear cut that was cut away about 10 years ago, and that was about 80 square meters per hectare. And the other factor we looked at, topographic position, we had one group at the base of this drainage, and the 2 others were adjacent about 7 to 10 meters or 20 to 30 feet above the bottom group. And the data you're looking at is actually LiDAR data that we were fortunate enough to have provided by us by the University of Idaho Experimental Forest. And this is very helpful for looking at canopy composition, but it also penetrates through the canopy and gives us a good idea of the topography of the field site, which allows us to estimate the hydrology. And using that digital elevation model we were looking at, we were able to create a topographic wetness index, which basically essentially estimates how water moves on the landscape. And as you can see here, at the base of this drainage, water is collecting at that site. And the cool thing about this is that you can actually go out and ground truth it a little bit, and we can see that the water table was very high at that low spot out in May when runoff was occurring, and there was actually a seep there. So that validated our topographic wetness model. And with that, we were able to estimate the hydrology of the field site. So predominantly, we hypothesized that we would see seasonal switching at the higher topographic positions, and then water not limiting to seasonal water logging at the lower topographic positions. And there is actually evidence of this in this photo, as you can see, of seasonal water logging to permanent water logging, this low kind of almost a meadow area. Trees weren't able to grow there, and that's, I hypothesized, because the water table was really high, and you can even see that 2 trees fell that were very shallow rooted. So a lot of water right there, and even kind of possibly on a really dry year, you might see complete reliance on rain at that higher topographic position. And as you guys all know, it was a very hot year in the Pacific Northwest, and sometimes you need to get a little lucky when you do a drought study. And we did get pretty lucky with, unfortunately, with really high temperatures, as you can see in this image, record temperatures, and also coupled with record drought. And actually, when we finished our field season, we were still in exceptional drought here in eastern Washington, northern Idaho. And I believe in Whitman County, this was the driest March through August on recorded record. So good year to be a drought scientist, bad year to be a tree. With that, we conducted field work. We took pre-dawn water potentials, fluorescence measurements throughout May to August. We even were there. We got a little snow on the last site in November, or the last field day on November. So that was really got the full range of conditions. And we got a lot of really good data because of those dry conditions. So looking at the topography and water stress, we can see that the well, first let me explain the measurements because you guys are probably familiar with physiological measurements, but pre-dawn water potential is an estimate of the water availability in the soil because the xylem is in theory equilibrated with the soil moisture water potential when the stomata are closed before the sun rises. And you can see here that the low closed canopy position at that low topographic position had more access to water later in the season when compared to the high closed canopy and high exposed groups. And the peak water stress, which is the midday water potential, which is more driven by evaporative demand, peaked around August when temperatures were really high, which is kind of a function of both water availability and water evaporative demand, because as you know, July was very hot, but that was not peak water stress midday. So what we're kind of getting from this graph is that these lower topographic positions kind of act as refugia for Western red cedar and other species, especially in a record drought year. And this is further supported by this time series, you know, kind of empirical data, subjective, but if you just look at this lower topographic position, that meadow I was previously talking about, you can see the persistence of herbaceous species through the end of September. Whereas up in the clear cut, there was ocean spray and mallow ninebark that were both senescing by the end of September. But here at this drainage bottom, we still see green herbaceous plants. And then it was till the frost of November that we started to see senescence of these species. Moving to leaf water content, in the high exposed group, we actually saw more consistent leaf water content than compared to the other closed canopy groups, which could be a sign of acclimation to it, suggests that, but you know, the data was kind of limited here. But moving on to morphological traits, we get a better picture of acclimation. Huber value, which is the sapwood area to leaf area, which demonstrates the supply versus demand relationship in leaf economics. You can see here that the high exposed group had significantly higher Huber value, which means that it was allocating more sapwood per leaf area and meeting a higher demand with a higher supply, or lessening the demand by lowering leaf area. Similarly, LMA, which is leaf mass per leaf area, was also higher in the high exposed group. And this also reduces surface area and increases succulence, which confers drought tolerance and higher light exposure by reducing that photosynthetic area. And you can actually visually see this. I'm sure everyone here who's worked with Western red cedar has probably noticed this, that in maybe more exposed, drier sites, you will get different leaf morphologies. So you can see here on the left, you have these more succulent, shorter needles, or scales rather, versus these other two with a lot more surface area. And if you take a closer look, it's pretty profound. You know, you can see these tighter scales, shorter, just a remarkably less surface area in these high exposed groups. Looking at chlorophyll, similar story here. We have less chlorophyll, which is kind of consistent with that higher leaf area. So there's less demand for chlorophyll in these because they have more light exposure. So there's not as much of a need to create more photosynthetic capacity, or this is the result of stress. Similar thing with osmotic adjustment, a physiological trait that basically shows in water limiting environments, when water content decreases, plants can increase their osmotic potential to help hold on water into those leaves and increase turgor. And this trait, it's up for debate, but this trait, there is evidence that this trait can vary within a species. And here we are seeing evidence of that in the high exposed group compared to the low canopy position, at least, that there's osmotic adjustment and acclimation to lower water conditions in that higher exposed group. And finally, we see evidence of repeated water stress in that high exposed group. Historically, we have higher 13C stable isotope ratios. So when a tree photosynthesizes, when there's a lot of carbon dioxide and the stomata are open, it's going, the rubisco, which fixes carbon, preferentially fixes 12C, just the regular carbon dioxide isotope that you'd find, or not isotope, just regular carbon dioxide that you'd find in the atmosphere. However, when the stomata are closed, there's less CO2 to fix for rubisco, so it does not really, can't discriminate against that, so it will fix more 13C. So this graph shows us that the high exposed group has had their stomata historically closed for longer, but over the course of the season, there wasn't a lot of change, but there is evidence of repeated stress. So kind of going to conclusions here from the data, we can kind of assume that low topographic positions can act as drought refugia for Western red cedar, at least in this field site in the southern edge of the range in the hotter spot. And this isn't really super new. I mean, there's a lot of research showing that these lower topographic positions are beneficial and could hold water and have higher water tables, but it is, shows that for at least this species, as temperature increases and drought might increase, that this might be a promising avenue for planting. However, obviously riparian zones can make that complicated. And then moving to the evidence for acclimation, I think there's a lot of evidence supporting that the high exposed group is acclimating to these harsher conditions. We have the physiological responses of turgor pressure or of osmotic adjustment. Chlorophyll content is different, and then morphologically, leaf area and leaf mass is definitely different in that group. And those changes in theory enhance survival, and there is evidence of repeated exposure to stress. So the story that I kind of got from all this data was that, yeah, there is acclimation to those more stressful conditions in that edge group. But it's not really clear what that group is acclimating to, whether it's the increased solar intensity of being on the edge of the clear cut, whether it's soil drought from being, having more evaporative demand, increased heat, increased vapor pressure deficit. It's not really clear what the trees are responding to primarily. However, all these processes are pretty coupled. So it's probably a combination of all of them. However, it would be interesting to kind of decouple those variables and figure out what's driving these acclimations. And then finally, it's not really clear, this was a study over one season. It would be interesting to see if this is more of a short-term survival strategy or a long-term survival strategy, whether these trees are just adjusting to kind of withstand maybe a 5-year drought period. And then when conditions are better, they can reverse back to more of an efficient state, or if this is a long-term survival strategy where, they're just, they're going to change their physiology to adjust to that new climate, and they can persist and eventually grow just as well as maybe another tree. So those are some interesting, promising avenues of research that I think could come out of this. And yeah, that's all I got. So thank you for your time.